When Rome ruled the world, the rise and fall of an empire. Our story begins not with stone and mortar but with a myth. It's a tale whispered through the ages, a story of gods, ambition and blood. Imagine two baby boys, twins, born to a princess but cast out by a jealous king. Their names were Romulus and Remus. They were put in a basket and pushed into the churning waters of the river Tiber. The river was supposed to be their grave, but fate, or perhaps the gods themselves, had other plans for these two infants. The river carried them to safety, washing them ashore at the base of a hill that would one day become the heart of an empire. There on the riverbank, a sound broke the silence. It was not a human voice, it was the howl of a she-wolf. She found the crying babies, but instead of harming them, she did something extraordinary. The wolf, a creature of the wild, became their mother. This powerful image of a wolf caring for human children became a symbol of Rome itself. It spoke of a city with a wild, untamed spirit, a city protected by the gods, destined for something great. As the boys grew into young men, they were discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus. He and his wife took them in and raised them as their own sons. Romulus and Remus grew up to be natural leaders, strong and brave. They were charismatic and commanded the respect of the other shepherds. They learned they were not ordinary boys but the grandsons of a king. A desire for greatness burned within them. They decided they would not remain shepherds forever. They would build a city of their own, a city greater than any the world had ever seen. They returned to the place where the she-wolf had saved them, near the 7 hills rising from the marshy land. But here, the brothers disagreed. To settle the dispute, they looked for a sign from the gods. Remus saw 6 vultures fly overhead, but then, Romulus saw 12. He claimed victory. He began to dig a trench to mark the boundary of his new city. It was a sacred line, a promise of the great walls to come. The founding of Rome was marked by tragedy. Remus, angry and jealous of his brother's victory, mocked the small wall Romulus was building. In a fit of rage, Romulus killed his own brother. He stood over Remus's body and declared, "So will it be for anyone else who dares to cross my walls." With this act of violence, the city was born. It was named Rome, after its founder and first king, Romulus. The new city was built on a foundation of both divine myth and human blood, a legacy that would shape its future for centuries. Romulus now faced a huge challenge. He had a city, but he had no people. Rome was just a collection of huts on a hill. To fill his new city, Romulus did something clever and controversial. He declared Rome a sanctuary, a place of asylum. He welcomed everyone, runaway slaves, exiles, men who had lost their fortunes, and those fleeing justice. The population of Rome grew quickly. It became a city of strong, ambitious men. But there was a problem. There were almost no women. Romulus knew he needed to find wives for his citizens. He tried to make alliances with the neighboring tribes like the Sabines. But the Sabines and others looked down on the Romans. They refused Romulus's request, mocking his new city and its desperate men. Romulus would not accept this humiliation. So, Romulus devised a cunning plan. He announced a grand festival in honor of the god Neptune. He invited all the neighboring tribes, including the Sabines, to come to Rome for a day of games, feasting, and celebration. The neighbors, curious about this new city, came in great numbers. They brought their families, including their unmarried daughters. The festival of Neptune began with great excitement. The air was filled with music and laughter. The Romans and their guests watched chariot races and athletic contests. But as the festival reached its peak, Romulus gave a secret signal. Suddenly, the Roman men drew their swords. They rushed into the crowds, not to kill, but to capture. They seized the young, unmarried Sabine women. The festival turned from celebration to chaos. Fathers and brothers tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and unprepared. The Sabine men fled in terror and rage, leaving their daughters and sisters behind. The captured women were terrified. Romulus went to the women and spoke to them. He promised them that they would not be treated as slaves, but as respected wives and citizens of Rome. Back in their own lands, the Sabine men were filled with shame and a desire for revenge. They gathered their armies and prepared for war. Led by their king, Titus Tacius, they marched on Rome to rescue their women and punish the Romans for their treachery. The war was long and brutal. Battles raged outside the city walls. The fighting was fierce, as both sides were driven by powerful emotions, the Romans fighting for their new families and their city's survival, and the Sabines fighting to restore their honor and reclaim their daughters. Just as the two armies prepared for a final decisive battle, something amazing happened. The Sabine women, who were now Roman wives and mothers, ran onto the battlefield. They stood between their fathers and their husbands. They held up their babies, the children of both Roman and Sabine blood. They begged the men to stop fighting. Their brave acts stunned both armies into silence. The soldiers looked at the women and their children and saw the futility of more bloodshed. The war was over. After the dramatic end of the war, the Romans and the Sabines made peace. They decided to join their two peoples into one. After Romulus vanished in a mysterious storm, believed to have been taken up to the heavens to become a god, the people chose a new king. His name was Numa Pompilius. Numa was the complete opposite of Romulus. He was not a warrior, he was a man of peace and religion. He created the main priesthoods, including the pontiffs who oversaw all religious ceremonies, and the Vestal virgins, priestesses who guarded the sacred flame of Rome. After the reigns of the first Roman and Sabine kings, a new power began to influence the city. This power came from the north, from a sophisticated and mysterious people called the Etruscans. They were skilled artists, engineers, and traders. The first Etruscan to become king of Rome was a man named Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder. According to legend, as he approached the city, an eagle swooped down, took the hat from his head, circled high in the sky, and then placed it back on his head. His wife told him it was a sign from the gods that he was destined for greatness in Rome. The Etruscan kings were not just rulers, they were master builders. One of the most important projects was the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, or the greatest sewer. This massive underground channel carried wastewater away from the city center and into the river Tiber. Another great project was the Servian Wall, a massive defensive wall made of large stone blocks 11 kilometers long enclosing the 7 hills of Rome. They also built the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the religious heart of Rome. What was life like for an ordinary person in this early city? For most Romans, life was simple and centered on two things: family and farming. The core of Roman society was the familia. The head of the family was the paterfamilias, the oldest living male, who had absolute power over everyone in his household. As the city grew, so did the division between people. At the top were the patricians, the wealthy, land-owning families. Below them were the plebeians, the farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen, and the poor. This growing gap between the rich and the poor would become a major source of conflict in Rome's future. The era of the kings came to a dramatic and violent end with the 7th and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. He seized power by murdering his predecessor, Servius Tullius. From the very beginning, his reign was one of terror and oppression. The breaking point came because of a terrible crime committed by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius. While the Roman army was away at war, Sextus attacked a noble and virtuous Roman woman named Lucretia. After the assault, she made her family swear an oath to avenge her honor, and then she took her own life. Her tragic death was the spark that lit the fire of revolution. A nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus carried Lucretia's body to the Roman Forum. He gave a fiery speech calling on them to rise up and drive the tyrants from their city forever. The people followed Brutus as he led a revolt. They closed the city gates and declared that the king was banished. The year was 509 BCE. With the king gone, the Romans created a new system called a res publica, a republic. Power would be shared between 2 elected consuls who would rule for only 1 year, advised by the Senate. A new era had begun. The age of kings was over. The journey of the Roman Republic, with all its triumphs and struggles, was just about to start.
Imagine a city shrouded in the mists of legend, a place born from myth and raised on the banks of the Tiber River. This was Rome. For centuries it had been ruled by kings, powerful men who held the fate of every citizen in their hands. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant. The people of Rome, a proud and determined folk, grew tired of living under the shadow of one man's absolute power. They yearned for something different, a system where they had a voice. The year was 509 BC, a moment that would change the course of history forever. He stood in the Roman Forum and swore a solemn oath. He declared that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. The people rose up, driving Tarquin and his family out of the city, casting off the chains of monarchy and stepping into an uncertain but exciting future. In the place of the old monarchy, a new idea was born: the Republic. The word itself, res publica, means the public thing or the public affair. It was a radical concept for its time. To prevent the rise of another king, the Romans created a brilliant and complex political system. At the very top were two men called consuls. These were the most powerful officials in the Republic. They acted as both heads of state and commanders of the army. Crucially, there were always two of them, and they were elected for only 1 year. Each consul had the power to veto the decisions of the other. The most influential body in Rome was the Senate. This was an assembly of about 300 of the most experienced and respected men in the city, mostly former officials. They were the elders, the wise men who advised the consuls and managed the Republic's finances, foreign policy, and daily administration. They were the enduring mind of Rome. The third pillar of the Republic was the people themselves, organized into various assemblies. These were the democratic heart of Rome. The most important was the Centuriati Assembly, which had the power to elect the consuls, declare war and peace, and vote on certain laws. This intricate system created a powerful balance. While Rome's political system was innovative, it was not perfect. In the early days of the Republic, society was sharply divided into two classes, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the aristocracy, holding all the political power, religious offices, and influence. The plebeians were everyone else, the farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers. They were the backbone of the city and army, yet they had very few rights. The breaking point came in 494 BC. In an event known as the First Secession of the Plebs, they walked out of Rome en masse, retreating to a nearby hill and refusing to work, fight, or participate in Roman life. This was a general strike on a massive scale. The city of Rome ground to a halt. Without the plebeians, the fields were untended, the shops were closed, and most importantly, the army was crippled. Faced with this crisis, the patricians had no choice but to negotiate. The plebeians were granted the right to elect their own officials, called tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes were incredibly powerful, with the authority to veto any act that harmed the common people. Another major victory came around 450 BC with the creation of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code. Now, the law applied to everyone, patrician and plebeian alike, and no one could twist the rules in secret. As Rome solidified its republic, it also forged one of the most effective military forces in human history. In the early days, the army was a citizen militia, fighting in a dense formation called a phalanx. This was effective on open ground, but clumsy in Italy's hilly terrain. The Romans re-engineered their army, creating the legendary legion. They abandoned the rigid phalanx in favor of smaller, more mobile units called maniples. A legion was divided into 3 lines of infantry. Every Roman legionary was a master of his craft, equipped with the best military technology. He carried a short, stabbing sword called the gladius, and 2 heavy throwing spears called pila, ingeniously designed to bend upon impact. After unleashing a volley of spears to disrupt the enemy formation, the legionaries would draw their deadly gladii and charge in for brutal close-quarters combat. This combination made the Roman legionary a formidable opponent. What truly set the Roman army apart was its relentless training and iron discipline. At the end of every day's march, no matter how tired they were, the legions would construct a fortified camp with incredible speed and efficiency. Roman soldiers were also engineers, building a vast network of straight, paved roads that allowed troops and supplies to move with astonishing speed. This systematic, professional approach was key to Rome's success. Armed with its powerful army and unified society, Rome began looking beyond its walls. For over 200 years, from the 5th to 3rd century BC, Rome fought brutal wars to dominate its neighbors. This was a slow, desperate struggle for survival that became a quest for total control. Rome's most difficult opponents were the Samnites, fierce warriors from the Apennine Mountains. The Romans suffered several humiliating defeats, including the Battle of the Caudine Forks, but they learned from their mistakes and eventually crushed the Samnites completely. Rome's method of expansion was as clever as its army was strong. After defeating an enemy, they often offered alliance or partial citizenship. This system turned former enemies into a source of manpower, making the Roman army grow larger with every victory. By 275 BC, Rome had achieved the seemingly impossible. The entire peninsula was under Roman control. Rome was no longer just a city-state, it was the master of Italy, a true regional superpower. With Italy unified, Rome's gaze turned across the Mediterranean Sea. Directly south lay the great city of Carthage, a massive maritime empire that controlled the trade routes of the western Mediterranean. It was a civilization every bit as proud, ambitious, and powerful as Rome. For a long time, the two powers had coexisted peacefully. Rome was land-based, Carthage was sea-based. But as Rome's power grew, their worlds began to collide. The island of Sicily lay directly between them, a tempting target for both empires. A minor dispute in the city of Messana became the spark that would ignite a firestorm. The Roman Senate made a fateful decision to send its legions across the water for the first time. This was a point of no return. Two great powers, both at the peak of their strength, were now set on a collision course. The First Punic War was about to begin. A titanic clash that would determine which superpower would control the destiny of the Mediterranean world.
The Mediterranean Sea was, the center of the ancient world. It was a highway for trade, a source of wealth, and honestly, a stage for ambition. By the 3rd century before Christ, two great powers eyed each other warily across its sparkling blue waters. In Italy, the Republic of Rome was a rising force. It was a nation of farmers and soldiers, disciplined and relentless. They had conquered the Italian peninsula, uniting its peoples under their single, unyielding standard. Rome was hungry, it was organized. Across the sea on the coast of what we now call Tunisia, stood the magnificent city of Carthage. It was an ancient maritime empire founded by the Phoenicians centuries earlier. The Carthaginians were masters of the sea. Their vast fleets of ships controlled the trade lanes of the western Mediterranean, bringing immense riches back to their sprawling metropolis. Gold, silver, tin, and spices flowed into their ports. Their merchants were shrewd, their sailors were the best in the world, and their leaders were drawn from a powerful aristocracy of wealth. These two cities were destined for conflict. They were like two great predators circling the same prize control of the Mediterranean. Sicily, a fertile island of strategic importance, lay directly between them, a flashpoint just waiting to ignite. So, what exactly were the Punic Wars? The name itself can be a little confusing. The Romans called the people of Carthage Poeni, which was their word for Phoenicians, acknowledging their ancestral roots. From Poeni we get the adjective Punic. So the Punic Wars were simply the Roman name for their three great conflicts against the people of Carthage. The First Punic War was primarily a naval contest. This was a huge challenge for Rome. They were a land power, a nation of infantrymen. They knew how to fight in tight formations on the battlefield, but they knew next to nothing about building ships or fighting at sea. Yet, the Romans were nothing if not adaptable. They captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship, copied its design, and built a massive fleet. They then added a brilliant innovation of their own, the corvus, or crow. This was a large spiked boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, locking the two vessels together and allowing Roman legionaries to storm across and fight as if they were on land. The Second Punic War is the most famous of the three. This is the one that gave us one of history's greatest military commanders, Hannibal Barca. The story of the Second Punic War is dominated by one man, Hannibal Barca. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a leading general from the First War. Legend has it that as a boy, Hannibal was made to swear a sacred oath upon an altar, to forever be an enemy of Rome. This was an oath he would honor with terrifying dedication. When he took command of Carthage's armies in Spain, he was young, brilliant, and burning with a desire for revenge. He knew that fighting the Romans at sea again was a losing game. He also knew he couldn't wait for them to bring the fight to him in Africa. Hannibal decided to do the impossible. He would march his army, including cavalry, infantry, and his famous war elephants, overland from Spain through Gaul and across the treacherous snow-capped Alps into the heart of Italy. The crossing of the Alps in 218 before Christ is one of the most legendary feats in military history. Hannibal's army faced blizzards, avalanches, and constant ambushes from mountain tribesmen. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, his army was a ghost of its former self. He had started with over 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Now he had perhaps half that number. Most of his elephants had perished, but he had made it. Once in Italy, Hannibal proved to be an unstoppable force. He was a tactical genius, able to read the terrain and his opponents with unmatched skill. He immediately won two quick victories at the battles of the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. At Lake Trasimene, he laid a perfect ambush, trapping an entire Roman army between the lake and the hills and annihilating it. The Roman Republic was in a state of panic. Hannibal seemed invincible. In 216 before Christ, they appointed 2 new consuls who promised to do just that. They raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled, perhaps as many as 80,000 men, and marched to confront Hannibal near the town of Cannae. What followed was perhaps the most brilliant tactical victory and one of the bloodiest days in military history. Hannibal arranged his forces in a crescent shape, with weaker troops in the center and his elite cavalry on the wings. As the massive Roman force surged forward, they pushed back the weak Carthaginian center, just as Hannibal had planned. At that moment, Hannibal's elite cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, swept around and attacked the Roman legions from the rear. The crescent had now become a circle. The Roman army was completely surrounded, packed so tightly they could barely lift their arms to fight. The slaughter was unimaginable. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the field. The Battle of Cannae should have been the end for Rome. Any other state would have surrendered. But Rome was different. In their darkest hour, they showed their greatest strength, their unbreakable resolve. They refused to negotiate with Hannibal. Although Hannibal had won a string of incredible victories, he lacked the siege equipment and manpower to attack the city of Rome itself. He remained in Italy for more than a decade, a master of the battlefield but unable to land the final killing blow. As Hannibal rampaged through Italy, Rome found a new hero, a man who could match the Carthaginians' brilliance. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was a young man who had survived the disaster at Cannae. He had witnessed Hannibal's genius firsthand and learned from it. While the older Roman senators were focused on containing Hannibal in Italy, Scipio argued for a bold new strategy: to take the fight to Carthage in its own territories. He persuaded the Roman Senate to give him command of the armies in Spain, where Carthage drew much of its wealth and manpower. In Spain, Scipio proved to be an exceptional commander. He was charismatic, innovative, and like Hannibal, he knew how to inspire his men. He studied Hannibal's tactics of envelopment and surprise, and he began to apply them with devastating effect against the Carthaginian forces in Iberia. He returned to Rome a conquering hero, and proposed an even more audacious plan. He wanted to do what Hannibal had done to them: invade the enemy's homeland. He would lead an army to North Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy, to defend their own city. The plan worked exactly as Scipio had hoped. As soon as his legions landed in North Africa in 204 BC and began winning victories, the Carthaginian government panicked. After 15 long years of fighting on Italian soil, Hannibal Barca finally boarded a ship and sailed for home. The final confrontation came in 202 BC on the plains of Zama, a short distance from Carthage itself. This was the heavyweight championship fight the world had been waiting for. On one side stood Hannibal, the master tactician, with an army of veterans from his Italian campaign mixed with raw, untested local levies. On the other side stood Scipio, the young challenger, leading a disciplined and battle-hardened Roman army. Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods for years. He knew about the elephants and devised a clever countermeasure. Instead of arranging his legionaries in the usual solid checkerboard formation, he organized them into columns with wide lanes running through them. When Hannibal unleashed his elephant charge, the Roman horn blowers sounded a deafening blast. The noise terrified some of the elephants, causing them to panic and turn back into their own lines. The rest charged forward as planned, but instead of crashing into a wall of shields, they were funneled harmlessly down the lanes Scipio had created. The decisive action was happening on the wings. Scipio's superior Roman and Numidian cavalry, led by Massinissa, quickly defeated their Carthaginian counterparts and drove them from the field. Just as Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae, Scipio now had the advantage. As the infantry battle raged, Scipio's cavalry completed its route and then wheeled around, charging into the rear of Hannibal's army. The Carthaginian line, now attacked from both the front and the back, collapsed. The envelopment was complete. It was Cannae in reverse. After the devastating defeat at Zama, Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty. They lost all their overseas territories, including Spain. Their navy was reduced to a mere handful of ships. For 50 years, a fragile peace existed. This recovery, however, made many in Rome nervous and resentful. One of the most vocal of these Romans was a stern and influential senator named Cato the Elder, who famously ended every speech he gave in the Senate with the chilling phrase, "Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam." Furthermore, "I believe that Carthage must be destroyed." The final pretext for war came in 149 BC, when the Carthaginians finally raised an army to defend themselves. Breaking the terms of the 50-year-old treaty, Rome declared war, launching the Third Punic War. The siege of Carthage lasted for 3 years. In 146 BC, Roman forces finally breached the walls. When the fighting was over, the Romans showed no mercy. The 50,000 surviving citizens were sold into slavery. The city was looted, burned to the ground, and according to legend, the land was sown with salt to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of an era. Rome now stood alone, the unquestioned superpower of the Mediterranean world. With its main rival gone, Roman expansion accelerated at a breathtaking pace. This rapid expansion brought unimaginable wealth flooding back to Rome. Gold, silver, slaves, and grain poured in from the new provinces. This new wealth, however, created profound challenges. It flowed disproportionately to the aristocratic elite, who bought up vast tracts of land and created enormous estates called latifundia, which were worked by cheap slave labor. The small-scale citizen farmers found themselves unable to compete and flocked to the city of Rome, creating a volatile, landless urban poor. Governing this sprawling new empire also proved to be a monumental task. The political institutions of the Roman Republic were ill-suited to managing a vast, multicultural empire. Provincial governors became immensely powerful and often used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the local populations. Ambitious generals, commanding loyal, professional armies far from the oversight of the Senate, began to behave more like warlords than public servants. The very legions that had conquered the world for the Republic were slowly becoming a threat to the Republic itself. Rome had won its great struggle for survival against Carthage. It had conquered an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Middle East, but in doing so, it had sown the seeds of its own internal crisis. The story of Rome's triumph over Carthage is also the story of how the Republic was lost and how the Roman Empire was born from its ashes. Rome in the 2nd century BC was a superpower. Its legions had conquered vast territories from the sun-scorched lands of North Africa to the rugged hills of Spain. Wealth poured into the city, creating a level of opulence never before seen. But beneath this glittering surface, deep cracks were spreading through the very foundations of the Republic. The problem was land. For centuries, the backbone of Rome had been the citizen farmer, but endless wars had changed everything. This created a vast, landless urban poor. This volatile, disenfranchised mob became a new and dangerous force in Roman politics. Into this volatile landscape stepped two brothers from one of Rome's most noble families. Their names were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus was elected as tribune of the plebs. He proposed a simple yet revolutionary law to redistribute land to the landless poor. The Senate floor became a battleground of fierce debate. On election day, tensions boiled over. A mob, led by senators and their clients, armed themselves with clubs and chair legs. In the ensuing chaos, Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers were beaten to death. Their bodies were unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber River. Into this fray stepped a man named Gaius Marius. He was a new man, coarse, ambitious, and a brilliant military commander. Marius's opportunity came with a frustrating war in North Africa against a king named Jugurtha. Desperate for soldiers, Marius shattered centuries of tradition. He ignored the property requirement for military service and recruited soldiers from the landless urban poor. He forged them into a lethal, disciplined fighting machine. He quickly defeated Jugurtha and was hailed as a hero back in Rome. These new soldiers were not loyal to the Senate or the people of Rome. Their loyalty was to their general. Marius had inadvertently created the very tool that would be used to dismantle the Republic. The man who would turn Marius's new army against Rome itself was one of his former officers, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The two men developed a bitter rivalry, which exploded into open conflict. Sulla's response was unthinkable. He did what no Roman general had ever dared to do before. He turned his legions on Rome. Another brutal civil war erupted. Sulla emerged victorious and declared himself dictator. He instituted the proscriptions, a horrifyingly systematic campaign of political murder. Thousands of senators and wealthy citizens were slaughtered. After enacting his reforms, he voluntarily resigned his dictatorship. But the damage was done. Sulla had written the playbook for destroying the Republic. 3 of these men would come to dominate Rome completely: Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Crassus had made his immense fortune from Sulla's proscriptions. The third man, Julius Caesar, was the ultimate political operator, possessing immense charm and a deep connection with the common people. In 60 BC, these 3 powerful men formed an informal alliance, a secret pact that historians would later call the First Triumvirate. The Republic was now effectively in the hands of 3 men. The Triumvirate was always destined to fall apart. The first crack appeared when Crassus launched an ill-fated invasion of Parthia and was killed at the Battle of Carrhae. While Caesar was away in Gaul, Pompey remained in Rome and gradually drifted into the camp of the Optimates, who feared Caesar's ambition above all else. Caesar was camped with his 13th legion on the banks of the Rubicon. According to Suetonius, he declared, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He gave the order, and his legionaries marched across the bridge. Civil war was now inevitable. Pompey and the Senate were caught completely off guard. Caesar swept down through Italy with terrifying speed, and Pompey fled east to Greece. The decisive clash came at Pharsalus in Greece. Caesar won a stunning victory. By 45 BC, he was the undisputed master of the Roman world and was made dictator for life. To his enemies in the Senate, his absolute power smelled of monarchy. A conspiracy began to form among about 60 senators. They called themselves the Liberators. The plot was set for the Ides of March. Caesar entered a meeting of the Senate held at a theater built by Pompey. The conspirators crowded around him and drew daggers hidden in their togas.
"You too, my child?"
Caesar is said to have uttered his last words, "You too, my child," before falling at the base of a statue of Pompey. The Liberators had struck their blow, but they had not saved the Republic.
"Friends, Romans, countrymen, behold Caesar's blood. Shall his murder go unpunished?"
At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony incited the crowd to rage. Into this chaos stepped Caesar's adopted heir, 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, now called Octavian. Octavian allied with Antony and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate. They defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, but like the first, this alliance was doomed. Octavian masterfully waged propaganda war against Antony. The final confrontation came at the naval battle of Actium, where Octavian's fleet crushed Antony and Cleopatra. At 32, Octavian was the sole master of Rome. The Republic was dead. He would take the title Princeps and the name Augustus. The Roman Empire had begun. The story of Rome's greatest chapter, the dawn of its empire, begins not with the gleam of polished marble or the triumphs of a united people, but with the grit and grime of a civilization on the brink of self-destruction. It begins not with glory, but with ashes. For nearly a century, the Roman Republic, an institution that had conquered the Mediterranean and given the world a new model for governance, had been systematically tearing itself apart. The very ideals it was founded on, shared power, civic duty, and the rule of law, had corroded from within, eaten away by ambition, greed, and violence. This was the age of the late Republic, a period defined by a relentless series of civil wars. The conflicts were not fought against foreign enemies on distant frontiers, they were fought between Romans for the control of Rome itself. Brother turned against brother, and the eagle standards of the legions, once symbols of Roman unity, now led charges against one another. These wars had raged across the known world, from the fertile fields of Italy to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, leaving a trail of devastation and despair. The Republic was bleeding and its wounds were self-inflicted. The crisis had been building for generations. The Republic's expansion had created immense wealth, but it flowed into the hands of a select few, creating a vast and dangerous gap between the aristocratic elite and the impoverished masses. Powerful generals enriched by foreign conquests began to command armies loyal not to the state, but to them personally. Men like Marius and Sulla had set a terrifying precedent, marching their armies on Rome itself, using their military might to settle political scores and unleashing bloody purges, known as proscriptions, where lists of enemies were posted in the forum, their lives and property forfeit. This new era of warlords culminated in the Clash of Titans. There was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, the establishment's champion, a brilliant general who had cleared the seas of pirates and expanded Rome's dominion in the east. And there was his rival, his former ally and son-in-law, Gaius Julius Caesar. A populist hero, a military genius who had conquered all of Gaul, Caesar possessed boundless charisma and an ambition that knew no limits. Their personal struggle for preeminence, for what the Romans called status and honor, plunged the Republic into its most devastating civil war yet. They marched their legions against fellow Romans, their ambition shaking the very foundations of the state. Caesar's ultimate victory and his declaration as dictator for life seemed to signal the end of the Republic. But his assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BC solved nothing. Instead, it created a power vacuum, unleashing a new and even more vicious cycle of chaos and retribution. The Senate, once the revered heart of Roman power and the steady hand guiding the state, was now paralyzed. It had become a nest of bitter rivalries, a theater for grandstanding speeches, and a hotbed of conspiracies. Its authority was shattered, its members either co-opted by warlords or living in fear of them. Endless political strife replaced deliberation and compromise. On the streets of Rome, the breakdown of order was palpable. Political gangs roamed the city, intimidating voters and assassinating opponents. What was once a symbol of law and civilization frequently ran red with the blood of citizens caught in the crossfire of political violence. It was a time of profound and terrifying uncertainty, a dark age where the future of Rome itself seemed to hang by a thread. The Republic was a failed state, and its people were desperate for a savior. Out of this turmoil, one young man emerged. He was an unlikely candidate to end the chaos. When Caesar was murdered, he was just 18 years old, studying abroad in Apollonia. He was Gaius Octavius, the great-nephew, and, as revealed in Caesar's will, the posthumously adopted son of the assassinated dictator. Overnight, he became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He was physically frail and often in poor health. He was not a fearsome general in the traditional Roman sense, nor was he a towering orator who could sway the masses with a single thunderous speech. Many of Rome's powerful elite, including the seasoned general Mark Antony, dismissed him as a mere boy, a political lightweight who could be easily manipulated and discarded. They could not have been more wrong. Instead, he possessed a different, more potent kind of strength, a razor-sharp political mind, immense patience, and an unnerving, unwavering will to succeed where so many others had failed. He was cunning, calculating, and utterly ruthless when he needed to be. He inherited a name that carried immense weight, a name that inspired fanatical loyalty in Caesar's legions and fear in his enemies. He also inherited a legacy of conflict and a world in flames. But he was determined to forge a new path, one that would lead not to his own destruction, but to the salvation of Rome. He understood something fundamental that his rivals did not. Rome was exhausted, it was sick to death of war, of proscriptions, of chaos. More than glory, more than freedom, more than anything else, Rome yearned for something it had not known for generations, peace. And he would be the one to deliver it, at any cost. His journey to power was a masterclass in political maneuvering. He navigated the treacherous waters of post-Caesarian Rome with chilling precision. He first allied himself with the Senate against Antony, only to betray the Senate and form the second triumvirate with Antony and another general, Lepidus. This alliance, unlike the first, was a legally constituted three-man dictatorship. Their first act was to unleash a new wave of proscriptions more brutal than Sulla's to eliminate thousands of political opponents and fill their war chest. It was a bloody, cynical beginning, but it secured their power base. He formed alliances with powerful figures like Mark Antony, only to methodically dismantle them when they no longer served his purpose. After defeating Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi, the inevitable rivalry with Mark Antony began to simmer. Octavian, remaining in Italy, launched one of history's most effective propaganda campaigns. He portrayed Antony, who governed the wealthy eastern provinces from Egypt, as a decadent traitor to Rome, a man who had abandoned his Roman heritage for a foreign queen, Cleopatra. Octavian positioned himself as the champion of Italy and Roman tradition, the defender of the West against the corrupting influence of the East. Throughout this climb, he was careful with his image. He presented himself not as a king or a dictator in the making, but as a restorer of the Republic, a humble servant of the state acting only to avenge his father and bring stability. He claimed he was fighting to give power back to the Senate and the people of Rome. But in reality, with every calculated move, he was carefully gathering the disparate reins of power, military, political, and financial, into his own hands, ensuring that no rival could ever challenge him again. He was building an entirely new system of government, one that ingeniously kept the outward appearance, the familiar institutions, and the reassuring language of the old republic, but was in fact controlled from the center by a single, undisputed leader, himself. It was a revolution disguised as a restoration. The final confrontation came in 31 BC, after publishing what he claimed was Antony's will, a document that left Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Octavian secured the Senate's support to declare war, not on Antony but on the foreign queen. At the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant friend Marcus Agrippa, decisively crushed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Their subsequent suicides in Egypt left Octavian as the sole master of the Roman world. The long, bloody, century-long era of civil wars had finally blessedly come to an end. The Roman world held its breath. After 100 years of chaos, one man held all the power. Would he be another Sulla, another Caesar? Would there be more purges, more conflict? Everyone waited to see what this young man would do with his absolute, unprecedented power. In a masterful stroke of political theater in 27 BC, he went before the Senate and announced he was relinquishing his extraordinary powers and restoring the Republic. The grateful and relieved senators, many of whom owed their positions to him, begged him to stay on. They officially granted him a new name, a name free from the bloody connotations of king or dictator, Augustus meaning the revered one or the illustrious one. It was a title with religious overtones suggesting he was sanctioned by the gods. This was more than just a title, it was the constitutional and ideological cornerstone of a new age. The Augustan Revolution was complete. The Republic was in truth dead. In its place stood the Roman Empire. Augustus had achieved the impossible. He had navigated the wreckage of a collapsed state and through a combination of ruthless ambition and political genius, had brought peace to a fractured world. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had begun. He stood at the head of a vast and now stable territory, the undisputed master of Rome. He was no longer just a man, but the first citizen, the father of his country. He was ready to reshape the Roman world in his own image and usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity, cultural flourishing, and stability that would last for 200 years.
The Roman Empire, for centuries, had seemed an immovable object. It was a vast, sprawling entity that had defined the known world, its legions a symbol of unmatched power, and its laws a blueprint for civilization. Yet, in the 3rd century CE, this colossus began to shudder. The foundations, once thought to be solid granite, revealed themselves to be brittle and fractured. This period, often called the crisis of the 3rd century, was not a single event, but a prolonged, agonizing convulsion that threatened to tear the empire apart. It was a half-century of chaos, a relentless storm of civil war, foreign invasion, and economic collapse that brought Rome to the very edge of dissolution. The Pax Romana, the famed Roman peace, became a distant, almost mythical memory. The crises were not isolated incidents but interconnected calamities that fed upon one another, creating a vicious cycle of decline. A plague sweeping through a province would weaken its garrison, inviting a barbarian raid. The subsequent military disaster would lead to the murder of the reigning emperor by his own troops, who would then proclaim their general as the new ruler. The chaos of the 3rd century was not born from a single cause, but from a convergence of devastating pressures that struck the empire simultaneously. The first of these was the immense and unrelenting pressure on its frontiers. Now those neighbors were becoming more organized, more aggressive, and more numerous. In the north, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, confederations of Germanic tribes like the Goths, Franks, and Alemanni launched deep, destructive raids into Roman territory. They were no longer just minor nuisances, but existential threats, capable of sacking cities and defeating entire Roman armies. To the east, an even more formidable enemy had emerged. The relatively weak Parthian Empire was overthrown and replaced by the aggressive and highly centralized Sasanian Empire in Persia. They were Rome's equals, a rival superpower with a powerful heavy cavalry and a burning ambition to reclaim territories in the Levant and Anatolia. The Sasanians inflicted several humiliating defeats on the Romans, even capturing the Emperor Valerian in battle in 260 CE, an unprecedented and shocking event that sent tremors of fear throughout the empire. To pay the soldiers whose loyalty was essential for survival, emperors resorted to drastically devaluing the currency. The silver content of the denarius, the empire's main coin, plummeted from nearly pure silver to less than 5%. At the heart of the 3rd century crisis was a catastrophic failure of political leadership. The old system of orderly succession, whether through heredity or adoption, completely broke down after the assassination of the last Severan emperor, Alexander Severus, in 235 CE. What followed was a grim 50-year period known as the Age of the Barracks Emperors. During this time, the throne became the prize of the strongest legion. The cycle was as predictable as it was bloody. A successful general on the Rhine or Danube frontier would be hailed as emperor by his legions, often against his will. To secure his claim, he would have to march on Italy, stripping the border of its defenders to fight the current emperor. This created a power vacuum that invited immediate barbarian incursions, further destabilizing the empire. While the new claimant fought a civil war against his predecessor, the Goths might be pouring across the Danube or the Franks across the Rhine. The Roman army, arguably the most effective fighting force in the ancient world, spent much of its energy and resources fighting other Roman armies. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 CE, there were at least 26 legitimate emperors and countless other usurpers and claimants. The average reign lasted only about 2 years. Almost all of them died violently, either assassinated by their own guards, killed in battle against a rival, or captured by a foreign enemy. By the time Diocletian, a brilliant and ruthless general of Illyrian peasant stock, seized power in 284 CE, the Roman Empire was a shattered wreck. It had endured half a century of near-constant civil war, its economy was in ruins, and its frontiers were breached on multiple fronts. Parts of the empire had even broken away, with the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, operating as independent states for a time. Diocletian understood that the old system was broken beyond repair. He realized that simply winning the next battle or printing more worthless coins would not save Rome. What was needed was a complete and radical overhaul of the entire imperial structure, from the way the emperor ruled to the way taxes were collected. Diocletian's first and most fundamental reform was to change the nature of the emperorship itself. He abandoned the pretense of being the princeps, or first citizen, a title used by emperors since Augustus to maintain the fiction of the old republic. Instead, Diocletian adopted the title of Dominus, or Lord and Master. He surrounded himself with elaborate court ceremony and protocol borrowed from the Persian court, making himself a remote, godlike figure. To tackle the shattered economy, Diocletian introduced sweeping fiscal and monetary reforms. He completely revamped the tax system, basing it on a regular census of population and land, a system known as the capitatio eugatio. To combat hyperinflation, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, which set fixed legal prices for thousands of goods and services, as well as wages for laborers. Diocletian's most ingenious solution to the empire's multifaceted crisis was the tetrarchy, which literally means rule by four. This was not a division of the empire itself, but a division of imperial responsibility. In the year 286, Diocletian appointed a trusted fellow officer Maximian as his co-emperor. Diocletian took the title of Augustus and governed the eastern half of the empire, which was wealthier and faced the major threat from Persia. He gave Maximian the rank of Augustus as well, entrusting him with the west, which was struggling with the Germanic tribes along the Rhine. A few years later, in 293, Diocletian expanded this system. Each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, or deputy, who was given the title of Caesar. Diocletian chose Galerius as his Caesar in the east, while Maximian chose Constantius Chlorus in the west. For example, Constantius was based at Trier in Gaul to watch the Rhine, while Galerius was at Sirmium on the Danube. This arrangement ensured that there was always an emperor near every major trouble spot, ready to respond to an invasion or rebellion without leaving another frontier dangerously exposed. The Tetrarchy was also designed to solve the fatal problem of succession that had plagued the 3rd century. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. When the senior emperors, the Augusti, retired or died, their respective Caesares would be promoted to take their place. For a time, the system worked brilliantly. The 4 rulers, working in concert, were able to crush rebellions, secure the frontiers, and restore a semblance of order and stability to the Roman world. Diocletian's carefully constructed tetrarchy, for all its ingenuity, had one fatal flaw. It did not account for human ambition, particularly the dynastic ambitions of its rulers. When the Western Augustus, Constantius, died at York in Britain in 306, his troops ignored the tetrarchic system and immediately proclaimed his son Constantine as the new emperor. This act set off a new series of complex and brutal civil wars, as other claimants, including Maximian's son Maxentius, vied for power. The most famous and decisive moment in his rise came in 312 at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. According to the story, on the eve of the battle, Constantine had a vision. He saw a cross of light in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, on their shields. He won a crushing victory, and Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River. While he was not yet a baptized Christian himself, Constantine attributed his victory to the power of the Christian God. From that moment on, he became a patron of Christianity, a faith that had been intermittently and sometimes brutally persecuted by the Roman state. In 313, he met with his then co-emperor Licinius in the city of Milan, and together they issued the Edict of Milan. Constantine's other monumental decision was his founding of a new capital for the empire. He chose a strategically brilliant location, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the vital sea lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. In 330, after a massive building program, he formally dedicated the city as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Constantinople quickly grew into the largest and richest city in the Christian world, a center of commerce, culture, and administration. Its creation effectively gave the empire a new heart. The reforms enacted by Diocletian and Constantine were, in the short term, remarkably successful. They pulled the Roman Empire back from the abyss and gave it a new lease on life. The chaos of the 3rd century gave way to the relative stability of the 4th. The adoption of Christianity provided a new, unifying ideology that, for a time, seemed to provide a fresh sense of purpose. However, these very solutions contained the seeds of future problems, particularly for the western half of the empire. Diocletian's division of the empire into eastern and western administrative spheres, though intended to be a temporary division of labor, created distinct governmental structures, military commands, and economic priorities. This practical separation, reinforced by Constantine's creation of a new capital in the east, accelerated a growing cultural and linguistic divide. The east predominantly spoke Greek and was more urbanized and commercially vibrant. The West was largely Latin-speaking, more rural, and increasingly economically stagnant. The economic reforms, while stabilizing the state, created a more rigid and stratified society. The new tax system, often collected by force, tied farmers to their land and artisans to their workshops. This system evolved into a form of proto-serfdom, reducing the freedom of the common people and concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a small number of massive landowners. Ultimately, the changes of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries set the stage for the final divergence of the Roman world. While the eastern half, centered on the magnificent and defensible capital of Constantinople, would flourish and evolve into the Byzantine Empire, the western half was left increasingly vulnerable. When the next great wave of invasions came in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire no longer had the economic or military strength to withstand the pressure. The legacy of Diocletian and Constantine was therefore a dual one. They saved the Roman Empire, but in doing so, they created a structure that ensured the long-term survival of the East at the eventual expense of the West. Imagine a city of gleaming marble, a metropolis teeming with over 1 million souls. A city of immense power and influence, where grand temples stood alongside crowded tenements. This was Rome, the magnificent, chaotic capital of the known world. For centuries, it was the beating heart of a vast empire, pumping law, language, and culture to its furthest corners. Its disciplined legions, the most formidable fighting force of their time, were not just conquerors, but also builders marching under the golden eagle to enforce the Roman peace. Its masterfully engineered roads, the arteries of the empire, stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Syria, binding its diverse provinces together for trade, communication, and control. The world knew Rome's strength. It was a power that seemed eternal, as solid as the Colosseum's mighty arches. The idea of a world without Rome, was simply unimaginable. But even the greatest empires can feel a chill in the air. By the 5th century, plagued by endless civil wars, economic decay, and overstretched borders, a long shadow began to stretch across the Roman world. The foundations were cracking. This encroaching shadow had many names. It was called Goth and Vandal and Hun, entire peoples on the move, displaced by forces further east. They pressed against the empire's weakening frontiers, seeking new homes and a share of its legendary fortune. Rome's strength had always been its army. The disciplined legions were the wall that protected civilization from chaos. But this wall was beginning to crumble. In the cold winter of 406 AD, a pivotal moment arrived. The Rhine River, a key defensive line, froze solid. A vast wave of peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, poured across into the Roman province of Gaul. The invaders swept through Gaul, looting cities and leaving a trail of destruction. This was a catastrophic breach of the empire's defenses. The Goths, under their leader Alaric, were a prime example. They had been allowed to settle within the empire's borders, but they were mistreated and exploited. They had learned Roman tactics, Roman organization, and Roman discipline. They were no longer the disorganized tribal bands of the past. The rising power of these groups was also a result of Rome's own internal decay. The empire was politically unstable. Civil wars drained the treasury and pulled legions away from the frontiers to fight other Romans. The year was 410 AD. For 8 centuries, Rome had been unbreached by a foreign foe, a symbol of eternal power. But that power was a fading memory. After 2 previous sieges left the city starving and desperate, Alaric and his Visigoths once again stood at the gates. The unthinkable was about to happen. There was no climactic battle. On the night of August 24th, the Salarian Gate was not stormed, but opened from within. The culprits were likely starving citizens or Gothic slaves, hoping for freedom or simply a meal. The city's fate was sealed by quiet desperation. The Visigoths poured into the sleeping city. For 3 days, a wave of plunder washed over Rome. Alaric, a devout Christian, ordered his men to spare the great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. But this was little comfort to the terrified populace as their homes were ransacked. They systematically looted palaces and the remaining pagan temples, stripping them of gold, silver, and precious silks. Centuries of accumulated wealth, the spoils of a conquered world, were hauled away. The material loss was staggering. When news reached the scholar St. Jerome in Bethlehem, he was so distraught he could barely write. For him, Rome was the vessel of civilization. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, he lamented, his words echoing the disbelief felt across the empire. The psychological shock was immense, far outweighing the physical damage. The fall of Rome was a profound symbol that shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. If the eternal city could be violated, then the very order of the world was in question. The final years of the Western Roman Empire were honestly a sad, kind of pathetic affair. Power was no longer held by the emperors in the city of Ravenna. The boy's name was Romulus. Maybe in a cruel twist of irony, he was given the grand nickname Augustulus, which means Little Augustus. In 476, Odoacer's army captured Ravenna. Orestes was executed, Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate, to formally give up his throne, and with that quiet, anticlimactic act, the Western Roman Empire simply ceased to exist. While the Western Empire was crumbling, its other half, later known as the Byzantine Empire, was thriving. The Eastern Roman Empire stood strong, its capital Constantinople a masterclass in defensive engineering. Guarded by the sea and the legendary triple-layered Theodosian walls, it was a virtually impregnable fortress, a beacon of stability in an increasingly chaotic world. The East was also immensely wealthy, controlling the vital trade routes that funneled riches like silk and spices between Europe and Asia. This constant flow of commerce filled its treasuries, allowing emperors to use diplomacy and strategic payments to pacify invaders and to fund a large professional army and navy. In stark contrast, the West was economically hollowed out. Its agricultural economy was shattered by decades of invasion and civil war. Farmland lay fallow, cities shrank, and Roman roads fell into disrepair. This collapse choked off trade, and without tax revenue, the state could no longer pay its soldiers or maintain infrastructure. The West was like an old, rotting tree, its economic roots starved and its political trunk hollowed out. The barbarian invasions weren't the cause of the fall. They were just the final gust of wind that pushed over a structure already dead from the inside. The fall of Rome in 476 wasn't really the end of the story. Its legacy echoed down through the centuries, shaping the new world that rose from its ruins. Monks in monasteries all over Europe painstakingly copied ancient Roman texts, preserving the knowledge of science, philosophy, and literature. Roman law also left an indelible mark. The principles of Roman jurisprudence formed the foundation for the legal systems of most modern European nations. Latin slowly transformed into the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. Though the eagles fell and the legions marched no more, Rome never truly died. The fall of Rome was also a beginning. The architecture of our government buildings, with their domes, columns, and arches, is a conscious imitation of the grandeur of ancient Rome. The flame of Rome wasn't extinguished, it was simply passed on. That flame burns still, in our languages, in our laws, in our buildings, and in our ideals. Rome has fallen, but it never truly died. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more history content. Albo.